March 14, 1944, Saint-Lormier occupied France. At 2:17 in the morning, the first bomb fell on a town that no longer existed. It came out of a low ceiling of cloud, a dark shape that whistled once as it tore the air open, then vanished into a bloom of fire and dust in the center of the empty square. The blast rolled through abandoned streets and hollow houses, rattling glass and frames that had no eyes behind them. Window shutters swung on broken hinges. Doors shuttered in their frames. A wooden cart toppled on its side and lay still. No one screamed. No one ran. No one called for help. Saint-Lormier had already gone. 3 hours earlier, the last truck had crossed the old stone bridge on the western edge of town. It had rattled and groaned under the weight of people and bundles, a moving shadow against the darker fields beyond. When its tail lights vanished into the countryside, the town behind it was nothing but walls, roofs, and memories. Darkness filled the streets. The wells were covered. The market stalls were bare. No lights burned in the windows, not even the faint orange leak of a candle behind a curtain. Even the church bell was silent, its rope tied off so that no accidental sound could betray the empty disguise. The town was not dead by accident. It was dead on purpose. In a cellar beneath one of those ruined houses, a man sat with his back against the earth and his daughter pressed against his chest. His name was Elias Mercer, and he was the reason Saint-Lormier had become a ghost. Before the war, Elias had been an ordinary man in a small place. He walked muddy roads with a toolbox under his arm, moving from farm to fix windmill motors, crackling radios, and broken battery sets that powered a single bare bulb in a kitchen ceiling. People knew him by his hands. They were always stained with grease and dust, always smelling faintly of solder and burned insulation. When he laughed, it was quiet. When he spoke, he kept his voice low. He had married young. His wife had died too soon. After that, he lived for two things only: his little girl and the work that kept bread on their table. In another world, in another time, Elias Mercer would have grown old slowly, bent over broken equipment and stubborn parts, a familiar figure in Saint-Lormier, known but unremarked. The war did not allow that kind of life. The German occupation came in the usual way, not like a lightning strike, but like a slow, tightening hand. Trucks in the square, boots on the cobblestones, new signs in a language many of the villagers did not read, uniforms in the cafe where old men used to play cards. At first, people told each other it might not be so bad. Then the shortages began. Then the curfews. Then the rules. For the German officers, who walked through Saint-Lormier with maps in their hands and pistols at their belts, Elias was a useful tool. They needed radios repaired. They needed field telephones rewired. They needed generators coaxed back to life by someone who could listen to a motor the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. Elias was summoned, not asked. Under the watchful eyes of armed sentries, he worked on German sets in the commandeered town hall, his fingers moving over foreign equipment, his ears tuned to the ever-present crackle of static and distant voices. They saw a thin man with tired eyes and a silent daughter. They saw a widower who walked carefully, who flinched at loud noises, who kept his head down. They believed he was harmless. They did not see what he did after sundown. When the curfew siren wailed in the evening and the town folded itself into darkness, Elias and his daughter went down into the cellar beneath their ruined home. The house had taken a glancing hit in an earlier raid, a stray bomb that had ripped away part of the roof and burned half the upper floor. The Germans thought it an unfortunate accident. For Elias, it had become cover. The cellar was narrow and low, with walls that wept cold moisture, and a ceiling of rough beams blackened by age and smoke. Shelves that once held jars now held coils of wire, cracked Bakelite knobs, metal boxes with their lids pried off, and glass tubes scavenged from wreckage. Every object had a history. This capacitor from a bombed-out shop. That tuning coil from a dead truck abandoned at the edge of a field. A length of copper taken from a broken church lightning rod. By candlelight, Elias had turned this forgotten space into something extraordinary. Bent over his workbench, he was no longer the quiet man who nodded to German guards. Down here, His hands moved with a different energy, quick and precise, as if they already knew what the next problem would be. He wound coils, stripped insulation, soldered connections that any professional engineer would have called impossible. He spliced cables that should not have carried enough power to do anything more than make a needle twitch. And yet, each night at exactly 11:40, the thing he had built came alive. It did not look like a proper radio transmitter. It was a patchwork creature, assembled from fragments of other devices, its wires twisting like veins, its tubes glowing unevenly with a sickly orange light. A battered battery sat on the floor beside it, connected by thick, improvised leads. A length of wire, barely enough to hang a lamp, ran up through the cracked ceiling and into the rubble above. By any textbook standard, it should not have worked at all. But when Elias threw the switch he had made from a knife handle and a scrap of brass, the cellar filled with a faint hum. Tubes warmed. The cheap meter he had salvaged from a factory panel began to tremble and rise. In the invisible sky above St. Lormier, a pulse reached out, weak at first, then gaining strength with each passing night, like a heartbeat learning its own rhythm. It did not carry words. They would have been too easy to understand, too easy to trace. It carried patterns. Short bursts, long bursts, carefully spaced pauses, complex clusters that did not decode to any known message, but that looked, to trained eyes and ears, exactly like the chatter of a busy command post. Equipment checking in, units coordinating, orders being sent, replies coming back. A small storm of activity centered on a town that, according to German maps, had no reason to host anything important. Miles away, in a dim room lit by green shaded lamps, German signal operators listened to the air, their headphones pressed against their ears. Their pencils hovered over sheets of paper. They were used to static and distant voices. They knew the random sounds of atmospheric noise and faulty equipment. This was not random. Night after night, they heard the ghost of a headquarters that did not officially exist. The pattern repeated. The rhythm stayed consistent. Sometimes it faded, sometimes it surged, but it never entirely disappeared. In their logbooks, they began circling St. Lormier as an origin point, tracing rough bearings, comparing notes. The more they listened, the more certain they became. Something was happening there. Back in the cellar, Elias never heard their voices. He did not know the faces behind the headphones or see the frowns of concentration. He did not know exactly when they would decide to act. He only knew that the pulses machines sent out had to feel real, had to look, through the opaque veil of radio analysis, like the unmistakable heartbeat of an Allied presence. He did know one thing very clearly. If he failed, people would die anyway. He had watched German convoys move through other villages. He had heard rumors carried by refugees who passed quietly through St. Lormier on their way west or south. Stories of towns flattened because someone had suspected a resistance cell. Stories of executions in squares not so different from his own. The war did not need a reason to be cruel. It needed only an excuse. So Elias had decided to give it one. He did not tell anyone about the real plan. When he spoke to his neighbors, he gave only fragments, half-finished warnings that made him sound more anxious than usual. He told them the bombing would come very soon. He told them it would not be like the raids they remembered, stray planes dropping isolated gifts of destruction. It would be systematic. It would be focused. They asked him how he knew. He did not answer. Some believed him immediately. They looked into his shaking hands and his hollow eyes and saw not a coward, but a man who had stared too long into an invisible storm. They began to pack in silence, gathering blankets, food, small valuables, and the few things they could not bear to leave behind. Others hesitated. To abandon homes and shops and farms was not a small choice. The war had taught people to endure, to bend like reeds rather than snap. What if he was wrong? They whispered to each other. What if there was no raid? What if the Germans punished anyone who left without permission? Every hour that passed deepened the tension. In the evenings, as curfew approached, figures slipped from house to house, speaking quickly at doors. Elias repeated his warning again and again, his voice becoming more strained each time. He never explained his machine. He never pointed to the antenna hidden in the rubble above his cellar. He only said that they had to leave before it was too late. At last, fear did what logic could not. The first carts began to roll out along side roads at dusk, piled with bundles under tarps. A truck that had belonged to a local farmer, now half legal and half condemned, was coaxed back to life. Children were lifted into the back. Old people climbed gingerly up, clutching bundles and rosaries. The exodus did not look heroic. It looked desperate and disorganized. But slowly, steadily, the town emptied. By midnight, the only lights that burned in St. Lormier were the faint glows of German cigarettes outside the commandeered town hall and the candle on Elias's workbench. Above him, the machine throbbed quietly, sending out its phantom heartbeat into the night. He paused once in the middle of adjusting a coil and looked at his daughter, who sat on a wooden crate wrapped in a blanket too big for her, her eyes following his hands. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain exactly why her small world was changing so fast, why her bed was gone, why her friends had vanished into the dark on the backs of trucks. But she was still a child, and some fear is too large to be laid on small shoulders. So he told her something else instead. He told her that they would be safe soon. He told her that the noise overhead would pass. He told her that sometimes, to save people, you had to convince a monster to swing its arm at the wrong target. Deep in the occupied countryside, far from St. Lormier, bombers sat on runways with their bellies full and their engines ticking cool in the night air. Ground crews walked between them with flashlights, checking lines and panels. In briefing rooms, officers pointed at maps where a small red circle had been drawn around a town whose name hardly anyone in those rooms could pronounce. A signal had been detected, a pattern that looked like a nerve center pulsing in the French interior. High Command had weighed the reports, considered the evidence, and chosen to believe the pattern instead of the silence in their own incomplete intelligence. Somewhere, a final approval was signed. Pilots tightened their gloves. Navigators folded their charts. Engines roared to life. Back in St. Lormier, the last truck crossed the stone bridge at just after 11. Its tires rattled on the worn surface. Someone in the back looked over their shoulder at the dark outline of the church tower and made the sign of the cross. When the truck disappeared into the fields, the town behind it became a shell. One by one, candles were snuffed out. A single curtain, forgotten in an upstairs window, was pulled down at the last moment. A door that had always been left ajar, even at night, was closed and latched. The well in the square was covered. St. Lormier held its breath. At that moment, as if turning slightly toward an unseen camera, the story itself seems to lean closer to the listener. If stories like this, of quiet courage and invisible trickery, make your heart beat a little faster, the voice of WW2 Frontline Legends invites you to stay with it, to subscribe, and to add your own small mark by saying in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. Somewhere, someone may be reading those words years from now, wondering how many people still care about a forgotten town and a man no history book remembers. Elias turned the knife, handled switch off. The faint hum in the cellar faded. For the first time in 2 weeks, the sky above St. Lormier was quiet of his making. He blew out the candle. Darkness folded around him and his daughter. In the distance, beyond the hills and the fields, he could not see the bombers forming up. He could not see the lines of lights along distant runways, or the faint wings cutting against the stars. He did not know the exact minute they would arrive. He only knew that they were coming, pulled toward his town by a heartbeat that had never really existed. He held his daughter a little tighter and pressed his cheek against her hair. Somewhere far away, the engines began to climb. March 14, 1944, St. Lormier, occupied France. The night did not end when the engines arrived. It only grew louder. If stories like this still matter in a world that moves on too quickly, the narrator quietly invites you to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and become part of the few who still listen for the truth behind the silence. Long before the first bomb touched ground, the air above the empty town thickened with a distant, rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was not a single sound, but a layered one, a swelling chorus of engines climbing through cloud and darkness. To the few who still listened from hiding beyond the fields, it sounded like the sky itself being dragged across stone. At 2:16 a.m., a final course correction was made high above the town. Navigators leaned over glowing instruments. Pilots tightened their grip. The red circle on the map became a real place beneath their wings. At 2:17 a.m., the first bomb fell. It tore through cloud and night and slammed into the center of St. Lormier with a violence that shook the earth for miles. Stone burst apart in a white flash. Fire rolled outward in a ring. The shock wave punched down alleys and into courtyards that had heard only wind for hours. Roof tiles lifted and scattered like throne cards. A shop front collapsed inward in a cloud of dust and sparks. There were still no screams. A second bomb followed, then a third. The rhythm of the raid settled into a brutal cadence, impact after impact, as if the sky itself were beating the town into rubble. Explosions leapt from street to street. The church roof vanished in a cascade of flame and shattered timber. The market square became a boiling pit of fire and twisting metal. Each blast echoed down into the cellar where Elias lay cradling his daughter against his chest. With every detonation, fine dust sifted from the ceiling beams and drifted into their hair and onto their clothes. The ground shuddered beneath them. The old walls flexed and groaned like living things under strain. Somewhere above, glass shattered again and again in a sound like hard rain. He did not count the bombs. He counted the seconds between them. 2, 3, 4. Each gap felt like a held breath. Each impact felt like a fist striking the planet. His daughter did not cry. She had grown very quiet in the last hours, as if some instinct older than language had taught her that sound was dangerous. Her small hands clutched the front of his coat. Her face was pressed into the place where his heartbeat thudded loudest. Elias felt her trembling through the heavy cloth. Above them, St. Lormier was being erased. Fire swept through houses that no longer held families. Beams collapsed into rooms where beds now stood cold and empty. The blast from a falling roof sent a wave of heat rolling down a narrow side street where only hours earlier, neighbors had whispered hurried goodbyes in the dark. A bakery that had fed the town for 3 generations vanished in a single concussion. The German bombers flew low enough that their shadows rippled across the rolling smoke. Their crews could see roofs fold and walls burst apart. Through the churn of fire and debris, they logged their strikes with clinical precision. Target neutralized. Secondary explosions observed. Fires spreading. From above, it looked like success. Deep below, a man listened to the sound of his deception being made real. The raid did not last long by the measure of war. It did not need to. Within minutes, St. Lormier was a smear of flame and fractured stone under a ceiling of roiling smoke. When the last bomb fell, the bombers lifted away in a long, dark procession, their engines fading like receding thunder. Then there was silence. Not the gentle silence of night returning to a sleeping place, but the hollow silence that follows catastrophe. Fire still crackled in the ruins. Rubble shifted and settled with the slow, whispering sounds of collapse. Somewhere, an iron bell that had been torn loose clanged once as it rolled into a gutter and came to rest. In the cellar, dust hung thick in the air. Elias waited long after the last echo faded before he moved. When he finally shifted, it was slow and careful, as if he feared waking the earth itself. He loosened his grip on his daughter just enough to lift her face and look into her eyes. In the dim light that filtered down through shattered boards above, he saw terror there, but also trust. He nodded once, a small, steady motion meant only for her. The worst had passed. They remained underground until the first pale suggestion of dawn filtered through the wreckage above them. Even then, Elias did not rush. He listened. He waited for the rumble of engines to return, for the bark of German voices in the streets. He waited for the sounds of boots and orders and rifles. None came. At last, when the light grew steady and the fires above sank into sullen pillars of smoke, he rose. He helped his daughter to her feet. Together, They climbed the narrow stairs into a world that had been rearranged by violence. Where his house had once stood, there was now a jagged shell. The roof was gone. The upper floor had collapsed inward. Beyond it, the street he had walked every day of his adult life no longer had a shape that memory could trace. Walls leaned at impossible angles. Craters yawned where doorways had been. The church tower was broken at the waist, its upper half lying across the square like a fallen limb. And yet, for all the destruction, there were no bodies. No shapes lay sprawled in the open. No limbs protruded from under beams. No blood seeped into the dust. The town was ruined, but it was empty in a way that even war rarely allows. Somewhere beyond the smoking ruins, St. Lormier's people were alive. Elias did not allow himself to linger in that relief. He worked quickly, with the same discipline he had used to build the transmitter in the first place. The machine was still in the cellar, unharmed by the bombs that had torn the surface apart. Its tubes were dark now. Its wires lay like sleeping snakes on the bench. He took it apart piece by piece. Every connection he had so carefully made under candlelight, he now undid in the gray light of morning. He wrapped coils of wire and tucked them into a sack. He removed the fragile tubes and patted them in cloth torn from what had once been a curtain. He pried loose the makeshift switch and dropped it into his pocket. The battery came last, heavy and dangerous with its remaining charge. By the time the sun cleared the low clouds, the transmitter no longer existed. Elias did not bury the parts together. That would have been a confession written in soil. Instead, he carried them to 3 different fields beyond the town. One he chose by the old apple orchard. Another lay along a drainage ditch where weeds already choked the earth. The last was near a hedgerow that had been cut back to make room for armored vehicles earlier in the occupation. He dug with his hands, using broken boards as shovels, and pressed each hidden bundle into the ground. When he finished, nothing remained on him that could betray what he had done. By the time the first German patrol entered St. Lormier, the man who had called the bombs down on it stood in the open like any other survivor returning from the countryside. The trucks came in cautiously, rolling slow over rubble that forced drivers to pick their way step by step. Soldiers dismounted with rifles at the ready, their boots crunching on broken glass and burned wood. An officer climbed from the lead vehicle and stood in the square with a map in his hands, turning in a slow circle. Somewhere, someone is hearing this story at this very moment from a place the war once touched. The narrator invites you to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and leave a comment saying where you are watching from around the world. They searched for what they expected to find. They searched for radio masts, for wires running into cellars, for crates of equipment, for bodies in uniforms that did not belong to this town. They kicked in doors that still stood. They pried open ruined cabinets. They dug at the edges of craters with methodical patience. They found nothing. Not a single transmitter lay in the rubble. No operators lay dead beneath fallen beams. No signs of a command post emerged from the wreckage. The town was simply a town that had been destroyed for no visible purpose. Confusion crept into the ranks. Officers argued in sharp, clipped bursts of anger. Maps were unfolded and refolded. Signals officers were summoned. Bearings were rechecked. Logs were compared. Again and again, they traced lines back to St. Lormier, to the precise center of a town that now held only smoke and unanswered questions. The more they searched, the less sense the raid made. By mid-morning, the patrol withdrew. Trucks turned and rolled away, leaving the broken town to its fires and its silence. St. Lormier had been struck like a vital organ and revealed itself, inexplicably, as empty bone. From a shallow rise beyond the fields, Elias watched them go. He did not feel triumph. He felt only release, a pressure finally loosening its grip on his chest. Somewhere beyond the horizon, his neighbors and their children and the old men and women who had trusted his trembling hands were alive because the enemy had chosen to believe in a shadow. 3 days later, the war explained why it had needed that shadow. 30 miles to the east, where German supply columns had been shifted and air cover redeployed to strengthen false expectations. A real Allied offensive slammed into positions that had been prepared to defend the wrong ground. Artillery thundered where skies had been left thin. Infantry surged into lines that had been quietly weakened. Vehicles meant to guard one sector now found themselves too far away to matter. German commanders reacted too slowly. They were still puzzling over the meaning of a bombed, empty town when the real blow fell. In the smoke and dust of that distant battlefield, men fought and died who would never know the name St. Lormier. They would never hear of the widower with grease on his hands who had built a lie big enough to draw fire from the sky. They would only know that their enemy seemed, for a moment, strangely unprepared. In occupied territory, whispers began to move along hidden networks. People spoke cautiously of a town that had been flattened with no one inside it. They spoke of miracles in the careful language of the afraid. Some said it was luck. Some said it was the work of the resistance. Some said it was the hand of God. Elias Mercer said nothing. He returned to repairing what could still be repaired. In the absence of a town, there were still machines to be mended, still farm sets that needed coaxing back to life, still batteries that refused to hold a charge. He worked where he could, always moving, never staying long in one place. His daughter remained close, quieter now, watching as she had always done. To those who crossed his path, he was once again what they had always believed him to be. A harmless man with tired eyes. A technician who knew how to make broken things work again. If a story were to end here, it would already be remarkable. A single town saved by an invisible trick. A man vanishing back into obscurity as quietly as he had stepped out of it. But war is never content with a single deception. 1 week after the bombing of St. Lormier, German signal intelligence intercepted a transmission that froze men in their chairs. It began with a rhythm they knew too well. Short bursts, long bursts, carefully spaced pauses. The same impossible heartbeat they had logged night after night before the raid. Only this time, when they drew their bearings across the map, the lines did not cross in St. Lormier. They crossed somewhere else, far from the ruins, far from the cellar, far from the man who had buried his machine in 3 silent fields. The room went very still as operators compared notes. The signature was the same. The pattern was unchanged. Even the faint fluctuations that had once marked the limits of a crude, underpowered transmitter were there, like a fingerprint stamped into the air. Someone else was sending Elias Mercer's ghost into the sky. Whoever it was, he or she knew exactly what had been done in St. Lormier, and they were doing it again. The German officer in charge of the watch stared at the plotted lines for a long time before he spoke. When he did, his voice was low and tight with a tension that had not been there a week earlier. Somewhere, he said, someone has taught the war to lie to itself. And no one in that room could say whether the lie they were hearing now would save lives or end them. The signal pulsed on. If you believe forgotten courage deserves to be remembered, the invitation is to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and stay with these stories. March 21, 1944, somewhere east of St. Lormier, occupied France. The signal pulsed again at 11:40, steady as a borrowed heart. In a listening post hidden behind layers of camouflage and discipline, German operators leaned closer to their instruments as the familiar pattern climbed out of the static. It carried the same uneven strength, the same faint sag at the edges of each burst, the same strange imperfections that no textbook transmitter should have produced. It was unmistakable. Yet St. Lormier was ash and empty stone. Pencils scratched frantically across log sheets. Bearings were taken once, twice, 3 times. Lines were drawn, then redrawn. They crossed not on the ruins of the bombed town, but deep in another sector altogether, a rural pocket of hedgerows and narrow roads where no significant activity had been previously recorded. The lie had moved. In the days that followed, German command wrestled with the consequences of what it had done and what it might do next. Reports from the eastern front of the recent Allied offensive were still arriving, each one another small confirmation that resources had been shifted away from the wrong place at precisely the wrong time. Supply depots had fallen with disturbing efficiency. Defensive lines had been breached before they could fully harden. The cost of misdirection was written in burning fuel and shattered armor. All of it traced back in the quiet corridors of intelligence offices to a town that had never held what they thought it held. Now the same phantom signal was alive somewhere else. If you feel the weight of this moment, you belong here with WW2 Frontline Legends, and you are invited to subscribe and let your voice be part of the record in the comments. At first, the assumption was obvious. Someone had salvaged equipment from the ruins of St. Lormier. A resistance cell, perhaps, emboldened by the success of the deception. A captured operator forced to replicate the pattern. The theories multiplied as the facts refused to arrange themselves into anything stable. German reconnaissance was sent toward the new bearings. Patrols combed through quiet farms and abandoned hamlets. Cellars were searched. Roofs were inspected. Antennas, even the most innocent lengths of wire, were torn down and examined. Men dug through earth with shovels and bayonets, convinced that the transmitter must be hiding just beneath the surface. Again and again, they found nothing. Each time the signal returned at 11:40, as dependable as a clock that no one could see. The broadcasts did not remain confined to a single point. Over the following weeks, the same pattern appeared in other places, sometimes only one at a time, sometimes two in the same night. Faint echoes of the original lie surfacing like ripples on a dark pond. Each appearance forced German analysts to reconsider maps, redeploy listening stations, and shift defensive priorities. The war, already a study in uncertainty, had learned a new language of doubt. In the countryside, word of the empty bombing at St. Lormier moved quietly through refugee lines and whispered conversations. Most never learned the full truth. They only repeated what they could understand. A town spared because it was hit when no one was there. A miracle shaped like destruction. The name of Elias Mercer did not follow those stories. He remained what he had always been in the eyes of the people who crossed his path, a thin man who fixed broken things and traveled lightly. After the bombing, he did not return to St. Lormier. There was nothing to return to, and too many reasons not to be seen near the ruins. Instead, he joined the slow, restless tide of displaced families moving through barns and half-forgotten villages, staying long enough to make himself useful, then moving on before his usefulness became a liability. He repaired generators that kept a single lamp glowing in a barn where a dozen families slept. He coaxed life back into cracked radio sets that had not spoken in months. Sometimes he accepted food for his work. Sometimes he took nothing at all. His daughter stayed at his side, growing quieter and more observant with each passing week, her small world shaped by movement and shadows. He never spoke of the cellar. He never spoke of the machine. To anyone who might have guessed it more, he was just another technician in a country full of men mending what war had broken. But the ghost of St. Lormier did not fade. By early summer, German intelligence began to recognize a terrible pattern. Each time the false signal appeared, and each time it was taken seriously, some other real movement elsewhere blossomed into disaster. A convoy ambushed where air cover had been drawn away. A depot destroyed after defenses were quietly thinned. A regiment caught in open ground while commanders argued over which phantom headquarters to strike next. No two of these events could be linked with certainty. Each had plausible explanations on its own. Weather, bad roads, partisan activity. But taken together, they formed a smear of suspicion that could not be wiped clean. Someone, somewhere, had learned how to make a battlefield bend. In private, German officers began to argue over whether the deception itself should be believed anymore. Some insisted that the safest course was to distrust every signal that did not come with visual confirmation. Others warned that doing so would leave them blind to genuine threats. The radio rooms grew tense. Operators hesitated before logging each new pulse. Commanders delayed orders while they waited for proof that never came in time. The war had not only been misled, it had been taught to doubt its own ears. In the ragged diary of a German signals lieutenant recovered after the war, a single line would later be noted by historians as unusual. It read only, "We no longer chase enemies. We chase ghosts." Meanwhile, Elias Mercer continued to move through the countryside like a man shedding skins. Each time the false signal reappeared somewhere else, he felt a tightening in his chest he could not ease. He never heard the broadcasts himself. He never saw the bearings drawn on unfamiliar maps. Yet, in the deepest part of him, in the place where intention had once lived hot and bright, he knew what was happening. The lie had escaped him. He had built it to look like nothing. Now it had become something that others could see and mimic. Whether it was a resistance group that had intercepted his pattern by chance, or another solitary tinkerer who had recognized the beauty of the deception, or even a chain of curious hands passing knowledge they barely understood, Elias would never know. What he did know was that every night, somewhere, an empty town might be spared because someone, somewhere else, had learned how to convince the sky to strike its shadows. In the late summer of 1944, as Allied advances accelerated and German lines bent and broke across multiple fronts, the phantom transmissions began to fade. They did not stop all at once. Instead, they dwindled in frequency and strength, like echoes losing their energy as they raced away from a single stone dropped long ago into still water. The war was changing too fast now. Air superiority shifted decisively. Real command posts moved constantly. What had once been an effective illusion became harder to distinguish against the growing roar of genuine traffic in the skies and across the airwaves. By the time Paris was liberated, the ghost heartbeat that had begun in the cellar of St. Lormier had all but vanished. Elias allowed himself one final, private breath of release when he realized this. Not because the war was ending, but because the lie he had once nurtured with such care had at last been swallowed by a larger truth. Its work, whatever its full measure, was done. He never told his daughter what he had built in the dark. To her, the war would always be a time of movement, of adults speaking in frightened fragments, of nights spent listening to distant thunder that she learned, years later, had been bombs. She would grow up knowing her father as a man who fixed radios and whose hands always smelled faintly of metal. When the war finally ended and the long, exhausted tide of families began to flow back toward the places they had abandoned, Elias did not follow them to St. Lormier. Others went and found only the outlines of old streets under grass and weeds, the faint archaeology of a town that had been smashed into a memory. Some rebuilt nearby, some moved on again. Elias settled instead in a smaller village farther south, where nobody asked him where he had been in 1944. He set up a narrow workshop in an empty shed and went back to the only life he had ever truly known. People brought him broken sets. He replaced tubes, rewound coils, soldered patient connections under steady light. When a radio came back to life under his hands, neighbors would smile in relief, as if he had summoned a voice out of nothing. He always smiled back, a quick, modest curve of the mouth that never lingered. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself around the scars of what it had survived. Roads were repaved. Factories restarted. Young men who had never seen occupation learned the war as dates and maps, as names printed in books rather than whispered in cellars. In archives miles away, stacks of wartime signal logs were boxed and shelved, marked classified, and forgotten. Decades later, long after Elias Mercer had been buried beneath a simple stone with his name and 2 unadorned dates, those boxes were opened. Historians and analysts, working through yellowed paper in softly lit rooms, began to notice anomalies that resisted easy explanation. A strange pattern here, a repeated signal there. Bearings that pointed to nothing. Raids that struck empty ground. Each fragment on its own meant little. Together, they hinted at a story that had never been written. When analysts compared the signal signatures recorded before the bombing of St. Lormier with those intercepted in other sectors afterward, they found the same peculiar imperfections repeated again and again, the same subtle sag in power, the same uneven spacing between certain bursts, the same telltale stutter at the beginning of each cycle. It was as if a single hand had written the ghost into the air, and strangers, years apart, had traced it with reverent precision. No document ever named the inventor of that first false heartbeat. No report credited a civilian technician with altering the shape of entire operations across multiple regions. The war moved on in official histories without him, guided by generals and divisions and the reassuring solidity of recorded victories and losses. But in the margins of declassified logs, in the faint pencil notes of men who had listened to the sky and learned to fear it, the pattern waited. Always before major evacuations. Always before misdirected bombings. Always just far enough ahead of disaster to change its target. The historians could not prove who had started it. They could not say whether it had been a single mind or several. They could only say that at some point, the war had acquired a weapon that left no physical wreckage behind. A weapon built out of nothing but belief and repetition. A weapon that had saved towns by teaching destruction to strike at empty ground. In the private quiet of those archives, one question refused to settle. Had a single father, working alone in a cellar beneath a bombed house, invented a language of deception powerful enough to ripple across an entire theater of war? Or had his creation simply awakened something that had always been waiting to be discovered, a truth about how easily a machine, and the men who trusted it, could be led? If a signal like that could be copied once, and then a second time, and then disappear into the chaos of a world at war, who, if anyone, might find a way to listen for it again? And, if they did, would they hear only the echo of a forgotten hero, or the opening beat of a lie waiting to be believed once more? If this story stayed with you, the narrator invites you one last time to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and to leave a comment with the place in the world you are watching from, so that this forgotten signal is never truly silent again.